Roy Orbison, the man whose haunting voice and dark sunglasses defined an era, was more than a singer, more than a songwriter. He was a figure cloaked in shadows, both literal and metaphorical. For decades, fans adored his music but wondered, what was he hiding? What pain drove him to write songs of heartbreak so visceral they became universal? And what truth, buried beneath decades of silence, makes his story darker than we ever imagined? Born Roy Kelton Orbison on April 23, 1936, in Vernon, Texas, he was the middle child of Orby Lee Orbison and Nadine Vesta Schultz. His father worked as a roughneck in the Texas oil fields, a tough, dangerous job that often left him exhausted. His mother, Nadine, was a nurse who balanced long shifts with raising 3 boys. They were not wealthy. In fact, the family lived in modest conditions, often scraping by on Orby's irregular pay. Yet in that humble household, music became the greatest treasure. It was his father who first placed a guitar in Roy's small hands. The boy was barely 6 when he began strumming, his tiny fingers struggling to form chords. Unlike many children, he didn't give up. He practiced relentlessly, sometimes until his fingers bled. By the age of 7, he was writing his own songs, simple melodies at first, but infused with a sense of longing far beyond his years. The Orbison family moved frequently in those early years, chasing steady work across Texas towns. Each move uprooted Roy from friends and familiar places, leaving him isolated. This sense of loneliness would shape his personality, and later, his music. In his own words, Roy once admitted, "I was always the kid standing in the corner. I sang because it was the only way to be heard." When the family settled in Wink, Texas, Roy found himself in a town that epitomized rural isolation. Wink was small, dusty, and dominated by oil rigs. Life was simple, but Roy's world was filled with dreams of something larger. He listened to country music broadcasts on the radio, particularly the voices of Lefty Frizzle, Hank Williams, and Jimmy Rogers. Their songs of sorrow and heartbreak resonated with him deeply. In school, Roy was shy and quiet, rarely drawing attention. But when he sang at talent contests and school assemblies, everything changed. His voice, high, soaring, and unexpectedly powerful, stunned audiences. People would stop talking, look up, and listen. His classmates, who rarely noticed him otherwise, began to call him the boy who could sing like no one else. Roy's education was unremarkable academically, but musically, it was transformative. He played with small local bands, most notably the Wink Westerners, a group he formed with friends. They performed country standards and popular hits at school dances, radio shows, and small-town gatherings. Roy was just a teenager, but his determination to make music his life was already evident. It was during these formative years that Roy discovered not only his passion for performance, but also the fragility of happiness. He suffered from poor eyesight, which required thick corrective glasses. Children teased him relentlessly, branding him an outsider. This ridicule made him introverted and self-conscious, yet it also pushed him deeper into his music. His voice became both his armor and his weapon, a way to command respect in a world that often dismissed him. By his late teens, Roy had set his sights on a career in music. He enrolled at North Texas State College to study geology, a practical choice encouraged by his parents, but he never abandoned music. While in college, he began writing original songs, drawing inspiration from his own loneliness and yearning. It was here that he first conceived of a musical style that defied convention, blending rockabilly with lush, operatic vocals. The boy from Vernon, Texas, was about to step onto a much larger stage. He had no idea that the world would come to know his name, or that his voice would become the sound of heartbreak itself. But behind every note he sang was a personal pain, one that would only deepen as life unfolded. Roy's path to success was far from straightforward. In the 1950s, rock and roll was exploding, led by icons like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Roy admired them, but he wasn't cut from the same cloth. His stage presence was awkward, his frame thin, his thick glasses hiding eyes he was too shy to reveal. Where others radiated charisma, Roy seemed to vanish into himself. Yet, his voice, otherworldly, soaring, full of ache, was undeniable. With his band, the Wink Westerners, he performed around Texas until they caught the attention of Johnny Cash. It was Cash who encouraged him to approach Sam Phillips at Sun Records in Memphis. Phillips was skeptical at first. He was producing fiery rockabilly hits, and Roy's emotional ballads didn't seem to fit. But eventually, Phillips signed him, releasing his early recordings like Ooby Dooby in 1956. The single achieved modest success, and Roy got his first taste of national recognition. Still, the road was rocky. Sun Records failed to fully invest in him, and his career stagnated. Roy found himself writing songs for others, penning hits for artists like the Everly Brothers, including their chart topper Claudette. Ironically, while others found fame with his words, Roy remained in the shadows. Everything changed when he signed with Monument Records in 1959. Under producer Fred Foster, Roy finally found a home for his unique sound. Foster recognized that Orbison's voice wasn't meant to shout over guitars. It was meant to soar, to tell stories of longing and despair. Together, they crafted a style unlike anything else in rock and roll. Operatic, dramatic, drenched in emotion. From 1960 to 1965, Roy Orbison ascended to superstardom. Songs like Only the Lonely, Crying, In Dreams, and Running Scared became international hits. His masterpiece, Oh, Pretty Woman, released in 1964, cemented his status as a rock legend. With its infectious guitar riff and Roy's commanding vocal performance, the song topped charts worldwide. Roy's appeal was global. In Britain, he toured with the Beatles just as they were breaking into superstardom. Despite their rising fame, the Fab Four admired Orbison, calling him one of their greatest influences. John Lennon once remarked, "We all tried to sing like Roy Orbison, but no one can." But even as success surrounded him, Roy faced challenges. His music, often described as too emotional or old-fashioned, didn't always fit neatly into the shifting tides of rock culture. The rise of psychedelic rock in the late 1960s pushed his operatic ballads out of the mainstream. He was also painfully shy in interviews, often deflecting personal questions. Journalists sometimes found him distant, even cold, not realizing that behind the sunglasses was a man wrestling with profound grief and insecurity. Indeed, the very sunglasses that became his trademark were born from accident. On tour in 1963, Roy misplaced his prescription glasses and wore dark sunglasses on stage. Audiences loved the mysterious look, and Roy adopted it permanently. Behind those lenses, however, was a man who often struggled to meet the world's gaze. Through the 1960s, he recorded hits, toured relentlessly, and worked with some of the biggest names in music. But by the 1970s, his career faltered. His style, once groundbreaking, was overshadowed by new trends. Record sales dwindled, yet he never stopped performing, never stopped writing. The world might have thought Roy Orbison's story ended with Oh, Pretty Woman, but his journey was far from over. And in his private life, storms were brewing, storms that would test him in ways no stage or spotlight ever could. Roy Orbison's professional highs were counterbalanced by devastating lows in his personal life. His first great love was Claudette Frady, a striking young woman he met in the 1950s. They married in 1957, and she became the inspiration for the Everly Brothers' hit Claudette, written by Roy himself. The song was joyful, but their marriage was turbulent. Claudette struggled with Roy's constant touring and the pressures of fame. Their relationship was marked by infidelity on both sides. They divorced in 1964, only to remarry in 1965, a testament to their deep connection despite the chaos. But tragedy struck just 3 years later. In 1966, Claudette was killed in a motorcycle accident while riding with Roy near Gallatin, Tennessee. She was just 24 years old. The loss devastated Roy. Friends recalled how he seemed to retreat further into his music, channeling his grief into haunting performances. Yet fate had even crueler turns in store. In 1968, while Roy was touring in England, a fire broke out at his Hendersonville home. His 2 eldest sons, Roy Orbison and Anthony King Orbison, perished in the flames. Roy's youngest son, Wesley, survived only because he was staying with his grandparents that night. These twin tragedies nearly broke him. To the world, Roy was the voice of heartbreak. In private, he was living it more profoundly than anyone could imagine. Still, life offered him a second chance at love. In 1968, he met Barbara Jacobs, a German teenager who had been a fan. They married in 1969, and Barbara became his rock in the years that followed. Together, they had 2 sons, Roy Kelton Orbison Jr. and Alexander Orbison. Barbara also embraced Wesley, raising him as her own. Unlike his tumultuous first marriage, Roy's union with Barbara was stable, supportive, and enduring. Roy's children would grow up surrounded by music. Wesley became a musician himself, continuing his father's legacy, while Roy Jr. and Alexander played crucial roles in preserving their father's catalog after his death. Beyond his marriages, Roy had other notable relationships. His quiet charm and fame drew admirers, but he was never a public playboy. Friends described him as gentle, introverted, and almost painfully shy in romantic settings. He longed for companionship, but was often too withdrawn to pursue it openly. Roy's personal tragedies colored his artistry. Songs like Crying and It's Over were not mere performances. They were emotional autopsies of a life marked by grief. His resilience, however, was extraordinary. Despite unbearable losses, he continued to tour, to write, to sing. For Roy Orbison, love and loss were 2 sides of the same coin. His personal life was not just a chapter in his story, it was the raw material from which his immortal music was forged. But the mystery of Roy Orbison, the deeper reason his songs resonated with such despair, remained hidden, until decades later the truth began to emerge. For decades, fans sensed there was more behind the man in the black suit and dark glasses. The tragedies of losing his wife and children were well known, but his songs carried a sadness that seemed to go even deeper, as though the music itself was crying out a secret. After years of speculation, biographers and those closest to him have revealed a truth that is worse than many imagined. Roy Orbison was not simply a singer of heartbreak. He was a man who lived with an almost constant sense of sorrow, loneliness, and self-doubt, long before tragedy struck. The mystery, in many ways, lies in the sunglasses. On tour in 1963, Roy left his prescription glasses on a plane. Forced to wear his dark sunglasses on stage, he quickly discovered that audiences responded to the look. Soon, it became his trademark. To fans, the shades gave him an air of mystery, even danger. But to Roy, they served another purpose. They were a shield. They hid a man who often felt too shy, too fragile, and too anxious to meet the gaze of the crowd. In interviews, he admitted quietly, "I was never really confident in myself. I always thought of myself as less than the others." When people compared him to Elvis Presley or Buddy Holly, he dismissed it. They had confidence. I had a voice. That was the difference. Those who worked with Roy confirmed this hidden struggle. Fred Foster, the Monument Records producer who oversaw his greatest hits, later explained, "Roy sang like a man who had lived 1,000 lives of sadness. He put everything he had into every note. But what people didn't realize is that wasn't just performance. That was him. The darker revelation is this. Even during the happiest times of his career, Roy Orbison never escaped a profound sense of melancholy. His personal tragedies in the 1960s only magnified what was already there. Psychologists who have studied his work point out that his songs rarely ended happily. Where most pop songs of the era were about falling in love, Roy wrote about losing it. Only the lonely, it's over. And crying were not manufactured heartbreak. They were windows into a man who never felt whole. In letters preserved by his family, Roy confessed that he often felt invisible. Even when he toured with the Beatles, who adored him, he still felt like an outsider. "I was the quiet man in the corner," he wrote. "People knew the songs, but they didn't know me. And maybe they never could." The more you examine his catalog, the clearer it becomes. In Dreams, he creates an entire fantasy world, only to have it collapse at dawn. In Running Scared, love is always on the brink of slipping away. His music was a diary of fears, insecurities, and longings that he couldn't speak aloud. Barbara, his second wife, was perhaps the only person who truly understood this side of him. She later admitted, "Roy never stopped grieving. Even in happy times, the sorrow lived in him. He carried it like a second skin." So the mystery, finally solved, is not about scandal or hidden affairs. It is about the silent battle Roy Orbison fought with himself. His iconic sound, his unforgettable songs, were born from a deep well of personal darkness that never left him. Not even in his final, successful years, and worse than we thought. That sorrow was not just a chapter of his life, it was his life. Though burdened by sorrow, Roy Orbison's final years were marked by a remarkable rebirth. By the early 1980s, his career had nearly faded. Rock had evolved, and critics considered him a relic of another era. Yet younger musicians recognized his genius and brought him back into the spotlight. One of the most notable moments came in 1987, when filmmaker David Lynch used In Dreams in the cult film Blue Velvet. In the movie, the song plays during a disturbing scene with actor Dennis Hopper, and its eerie beauty stunned audiences. Suddenly, Roy's voice was back in the cultural conversation, celebrated not just as nostalgic, but as timeless and haunting. Around the same time, artists like Bruce Springsteen, Elvis Costello, and K.D. Lang openly championed Orbison's influence. Springsteen, who often cited Roy as his greatest vocal inspiration, performed tributes to him in concert, telling audiences, "Roy Orbison is the greatest singer in the world." Roy himself seemed almost surprised by this resurgence. After years of being overlooked, he was invited to perform a televised concert in Los Angeles in 1987. The program, Roy Orbison and Friends, A Black and White Night, featured an all-star band including Bruce Springsteen, Elvis Costello, Jackson Browne, and Tom Waits. Broadcast on HBO, the concert became legendary, proving that Orbison's voice had lost none of its power. His haunting performance of Crying that night brought the audience and his fellow musicians to tears. The pinnacle of this comeback came with the formation of the Traveling Wilburys in 1988, alongside George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. Roy found himself part of a supergroup that felt like a dream. Their first album, Traveling Wilburys Vol. 1, was a critical and commercial triumph. Roy's contributions, especially the song Not Alone Anymore, stood out as proof that his voice was as commanding as ever. At the same time, he was recording a new solo album, Mystery Girl, with Jeff Lynne producing. The sessions were joyous, filled with camaraderie and creativity. Songs like You Got It revealed a lighter, more hopeful side of Orbison, blending his classic emotional depth with a renewed optimism. Those who were there recalled how excited Roy was. After years of decline, he finally felt he was stepping into a new golden era. But fate intervened cruelly. On December 6, 1988, Roy Orbison died of a heart attack at his mother's home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He was only 52. Just days before, he had been planning more recordings and tours, full of energy and ambition. The shock of his death reverberated through the music world. In the months that followed, Mystery Girl was released posthumously. It became one of his most successful albums, with You Got It reaching the top of the charts. Fans who had only just rediscovered him were devastated that he was gone. But his legacy only grew. Over the decades, Roy Orbison has remained a towering figure in music. His songs continue to appear in films, television, and covers by artists across genres. His family has worked tirelessly to preserve his legacy, releasing remastered editions of his albums, documentaries, and even a hologram tour that allowed new generations to experience his voice in concert. Today, critics hail him as one of the greatest vocalists in rock history, a man whose operatic style defied categories. He influenced the Beatles, inspired generations of singer-songwriters, and proved that vulnerability could be just as powerful as swagger in popular music. His legacy lies not only in his songs, but in what they represent. Roy Orbison showed that from the deepest sorrow can come the most beautiful art. He was not just the Big O, not just the man in black sunglasses. He was the embodiment of the human heart's resilience. The Roy Orbison mystery has finally been solved. It was never about spectacle or scandal. It was about a man who lived in shadow, carried unspeakable sorrow, and transformed it into something transcendent. And as long as voices rise in song, trembling with longing and loss, Roy Orbison's spirit will remain, proof that even heartbreak can be immortal.